Cool. All the judges are okay? You can hear clearly? Yep, excellent. So if there are any issues, please send a message to me privately on the chat box. To the team, so I'll be keeping time and I will be giving you time signals. So I'll be doing this for 1, for 6, and for 7. But to be on the safe side, please time yourselves as well. This becomes especially important just in case we have internet connectivity issues, but hopefully we won't. All right, so on the motion that this House believes that the response to global pandemics should be led by experts instead of politicians, it's my honor to welcome the first speaker of the proposition side to open this debate.
Hello. Okay. The coronavirus has proven that politicians are woefully inadequate at handling global pandemics. What do we support? We believe that after the World Health Organization declares a pandemic, both within countries and in international institutions, boards of independently selected experts take control of policy and pandemic response. On these boards, we're going to have a balanced range of perspectives from multiple fields. We think when it comes to, for example, economic policy, we're going to have far more economists than in disease-related policy, but we think we're still going to get a range of opinions that are being discussed from a range of sectors. These boards are able to pass policy, but also are the primary mechanism by which the public are informed. For example, coronavirus daily briefings that many countries hold are going to be controlled by these experts. What is this debate about? We think some things are more important than anything else. And in this case, in a crisis, in a pandemic, it is about saving lives, curing people, and stopping the spread of the virus or any other disease so that the economy can restart, so that the country can emerge successfully and move on as unscathed as possible.
Sure.
No, thank you, because we do not believe that democracy is always fundamental. We do think we have things like the Supreme Court, the Federal Reserve that specifically deal with situations in which we do not believe democracy is adequate. Therefore, I'm going to bring a point about why the politicization of pandemic response necessarily weakens it and makes it less effective. My partner is going to talk to you about why on their side, they're going to have the scapegoating of the problem and necessarily the discourse changes in a very harmful way. First of all, politicization.
Sure.
Look, no thank you. We think politicians in dozens of countries have failed to heed the advice of experts. For example, Trump going into lockdown way too late after many others advised it. Because we believe that politicians by nature are less equipped and less likely to effectively stall and contain pandemics.
Please.
First of all, some framing. No thank you. We think regardless of how informed politicians are, regardless of the information they have, regardless of how they are advised, politicians have perverse incentives from the very beginning. We think ultimately what they want to do is win elections and secure their position of power. We think 4 negative incentives result from this. First of all, they particularly want to please lobbyists and those who have money to donate, because in many cases, winning elections is based on your ability to campaign and your ability to procure funding. Second of all, they're less likely to care about people who do not vote because of the fact that these groups generally tend to be less politically valuable. Winning over their opinion is not going to do much for you in terms of winning elections. Third of all, we think they're influenced by their party ideology because of the fact that this is the mindset that they have and affects how they're actually going to respond to a certain issue. Fourth of all, they want to maintain their image so that they are viewed as someone who's electable, particularly within their own base of voters who generally want someone who's consistent. Yeah, go.
Do you think having a disastrous response to a global pandemic makes for a really good electable politician?
Look, I'm not sure what you're talking about, but ultimately in these situations, politicians are going to have perverse incentives that mean they're less able to effectively create policies. What is the comparative? We believe experts are generally individuals who have extensive education in the field and are likely to have great dedication to it personally because they use their education and use their position of privilege to go into it and to gain as high a knowledge of it as possible. We think given that they already have stable careers in universities or research institutes, there's no particular pressure on them to placate and help particular voting groups or lobbyists. We think ultimately they're far more likely to prioritize helping the country as a whole and helping the field as a whole because of the fact that they do not have these adverse these adverse pressures harming them. So thank you. And they've proven their passion in advancing a particular field. For example, epidemiologists have demonstrated their passion in ensuring that humanity can fight diseases. Therefore, we think there are 5 negative impacts from this, particularly when pertaining to politicians. The first, that we're less likely to get global cooperation. This is important because it is a global pandemic. What this looks like is, for example, the United Kingdom rejecting working with the European Union in terms of sharing resources, and Trump calling the coronavirus the China virus. We think experts are far more likely to cooperate, no thank you, with experts from other countries, largely because often that is the status quo, right? When it comes to research, when it comes to the process of learning, that is what already happens. but we think politicians are unlikely to cooperate because of the fact that geopolitical squabbles generally are going to play into this. For example, Trump largely won a base of voters who had huge misapprehensions of and were hugely mistrustful of China. So if Trump is seen cooperating with China, if Trump is seen not acting in a way that is aggressive towards China as he has done before, as his voters want, then it's necessarily the case that ultimately he looks bad, he looks weak, and he looks someone who's not consistent. This also looks like, for example, Boris Johnson, who's able to gain a huge platform based off his support for Brexit, not wanting to work for the EU, because he looks like someone who goes back on earlier policies and earlier rhetoric. Second of all, we think the response, this is crucial, we think the response is likely to ignore those who are most vulnerable on their side of the house. Because thank you. We think politicians are likely going to be majoritarian to a great extent. That is to say, they want to win a majority of votes, but also they generally want to win over those who are politically valuable, and that they give you money and votes and capital for donations, etc. We think specifically this excludes those who are poorest, those who are disenfranchised, those who do not vote and do not donate, and therefore are not valuable for a politician to win. We think this, for example, looks like African American communities, which have by far the worst rates of coronavirus. We think because of the fact that politicians are less likely to prioritize them, because of the fact that they're likely going to try and prioritize funding and help and aid towards the communities that are most valuable in terms of winning elections. For example, swing states, states with lots of middle class people, states with lots of voting people. That is when you don't get resources going to these poorest areas. This is crucial because these poorest areas are the areas that have the least resilience, the least healthcare, for example, and the least availability to actively, adapt to new measures because these areas tend to be poorer. But third of all, we think you're likely to get a suppression of information generally within a country. Why? This looks like, for example, China arresting experts who tried to tell the public about the true extent of the virus. Because the extent at which politicians want to maintain a reputation and goodwill in terms of among the voters, but also in the country as a whole, that is when they try to deny the extent to which the virus has happened, because they necessarily care about their reputation. And the fact is, if they admit that the virus has reached a certain point, that's when they admit that they have failed as a politician. So therefore, we think the people, businesses, are unable to take proper precautions because the people they listen to, the politicians, are never going to admit the true extent to which the virus has been a problem. But we think experts don't have these similar influences because of the fact that they already have a stable career and have a stable position, and therefore public opinion is unlikely to influence them in this respect. But fourth of all, we think even in their best case, in which you have politicians who are effectively able to take the advice of experts, we think this results in policies still being delayed. So thank you. Because even if politicians are advised by a board of experts, this process takes time at the point at which information has to travel from experts to politicians, experts who already have this knowledge and already have the expertise and the analysis. We think this is crucial because of the fact that ultimately, in terms of pandemics, margins of time mean huge numbers of lives lost. The fact that we're able to contain it the fact that we're able to get a policy ready within even a shorter amount of time means we're able to save a huge number of lives. Finally, and crucially, we think politicians are by nature hindered by party boundaries and ideologies. We think, first of all, political squabbles often interfere with decisions. For example, Trump refusing to do a lockdown early on because in many cases, the Democrats were actively asking him and pressuring him to do it. Because if you were a Republican and you submit to Democrat pressure or submit to Democrat requests, that is when you look weak. That's when you're going back on your promise to your voters because you as a politician had a huge amount of aggressive rhetoric against them when you campaigned against them in the past, which means that you didn't have an incentive to not do things that the other side advocates. But also, we think a politician's ideology necessarily restricts the range of options available to them. For example, libertarian politicians are unlikely to support a quarantine. Socialist politicians are rarely ever going to reduce taxes to help with stimulus. On our side, given that you have, as I explicitly told you, you have a range of experts from different positions or different fields, we think you're ultimately going to have more choice because you don't have specific policies or specific actions excluded from the outset. Therefore, on their side, you have one party who has power from one particular ideological position, and therefore a huge range of options is away from them. These are potentially could be options that necessarily help us to combat the virus. So what have I told you? On our side, reform are likely to have a comprehensive and effective response that saves lives. Governments hold huge amounts of power. On our side, we're able to weaponize that to ensure that as few people are killed as possible and the economy can recover as soon as possible. On their side, it is necessarily hindered.
Thank you very much. And we now welcome the first speaker on the opposition side.
Can you hear me? when we're talking about a pandemic, the most important thing is not only to solve this pandemic, but to ensure that the world goes back to normal. Because we might take measures that are so extreme that we literally have an economic meltdown and more people die of starvation than they die of the actual virus that we're trying to fight. Thus, I'll have some elements of setup, then I'll rebut their case, and I'll have two arguments. First of all, regarding legitimacy. Second of all, regarding how we reach a better overall result. And then my colleague on the second speaker will talk to you about how giving the call to experts guarantees significant backlash. First of all, the setup. First point, we're telling you that this motion is played in countries where it's reasonable to outsource the decision to experts, which means we're talking about functional democracies. What this means is that they already consult experts. And we believe that this is okay because we want them to consult the experts, but we want politicians to have the final say. This is very important because it interacts with their model, because they have this committee of experts from different fields, but they never explain how they would reach a decision. Because if I have an economic expert that is telling me that I'm going to have an economic meltdown, but I have a pandemic expert that is telling me that we should stay at home and we should shut down the entire economy, how are they going to decide? You need to have a mediator. In our current situation, the mediator is the politician, which means that their model is flawed. We don't see how this how this creates a more efficient process. We're telling you that we don't that they're likely going to have a biased outcome. Moreover than that, second point here, who actually wins the debate? We believe that to win the debate, they have to prove that first, they have legitimate decision makers, and second of all, that the world goes back to normal. What does this mean? To get the best social interest for everybody, which means that showing that they have a better response to COVID-19 or any other pandemic isn't enough. They have to prove that overall the situation is better for most people. Now, let me interact with their argument in which they try to prove that we have less effective responses because politicians let their personal interests intervene. But on their framing, on their argumentation, the personal interest of the politician is to get reelected, which means that it cares about dealing with the pandemic as efficiently as possible. But why? Because when I show on the television that 100 people died because of the inaction of the government, this influences all voters, regardless of whether they're rich, they're poor, they're Democrat or Republican. Everybody sees me as a failed politician. So I'm certainly going to lose votes. I'm certainly not going to get elected in the next term. So on their argumentation, if we are to believe that politicians only care about getting reelected, then this is the way in which we hold them accountable, and we are able to produce the best responses. What does this rebuttal prove? First of all, that the whole point that the vulnerable are the most affected doesn't actually stand. People dying is bad whether they're poor or rich, which means that people are not going to vote for you regardless if you are being sustained by the rich in power. Moreover, their point with global cooperation also doesn't work, because if you fail to cooperate and that leads to a worse outcome, it means you lose the next election. It means that you lose on your interests. So we're telling you that politicians are still going to be efficient. Their entire argument doesn't actually stand. Now, let me enter my first argument regarding legitimacy. Before that, if you have a POI. Okay.
Was it fair that the first few economic packages in the UK went to medium and large businesses, who are coincidentally are the majority voter base of the Conservative government?
We believe that, first of all, this was something that was taken bipartisan. So both parties agreed that they should implement this. But moreover, we're telling you that this is the type of measure that is likely going to be implemented on our side when we actually take into account what is going to happen to the economy. On their side, they're not even going to think about that. They're just going to impose something like a 4-month lockdown, because that is the best way to deal with the pandemic. Let's talk about legitimacy. We're telling you in this argument that elected politicians are the only legitimate actors that can make decisions in times of crisis. Why? Because decisions on political issues are taken by people that received power through elections. First of all, because they are the ones that people invested their power into, but moreover than that, they can be held accountable. Just by the fact that they want to be elected again and they have to be voted again means that the population has a certain, that these people have a certain amount of accountability towards their electorate. This is why, first of all, they can make decisions in times of crisis. They are allowed to take certain actions and to decide whether how long the lockdown should be, whether we should have a lockdown in the first place, or whether we should impose a stimulus plan. Moreover, they can use the tools of the state, such as violence, such as restricting rights from people in a legitimate manner. And what this proves is that in all political decisions, the politicians are the only legitimate actor that can do that. And this is a political decision, because because you have an intrinsic trade-off between conflicting interests. You have people that might die from the pandemic, and you have people that are likely going to lose their job. They're not going to be able to get their kids through school. They're not going to be able to put food on the table because of the fact that they don't have a job anymore. This is a trade-off between conflicting interests that should be taken by politicians. The same way that in 2008, if we were to follow only the advice of experts, we would have had complete austerity, and we wouldn't care about welfare and how people actually live. And that means that in general, the situation for the population would have been worse. What does this argument prove? First of all, that any decisions that these experts would take is illegitimate, but moreover than that, any tools that they might use, such as the use of police in order to put people back in their houses or to fine people because they got out of the house when they weren't supposed to, this is also illegitimate. Thus, the experts should not be able to take these decisions. But let me enter the second argument regarding how you have better overall results, because allowing politicians to make the decisions leads to these better overall results. Why? Because in general, experts will have a professional bias. So if I'm an expert and I only study pandemics, of course, I'm going to overblow the impacts of the pandemic, or I'm just going to think about the pandemic and how this is going to affect the world. I will prioritize stopping the pandemic rather than think about all the people that will lose their jobs and will not be able to take their kids to college in the future, or more immediately, they will not be able to provide food for them in the next few months because they are lacking a job. What would politicians do? We're telling you that they generally care about the entire population. They don't only care about the pandemic, and neither does the population, because this is why we have protests against some of the lockdowns, because they were so excessive that in certain situations, people who didn't have a job could not provide for their family because these things were so restrictive. Politicians would generally try to promote aggregate welfare, and they will try to please as many people as possible because they have to show that they're competent even in a time of crisis. What this means is that on our side of the house, what they're likely going to do is to create a trade-off between the economical downsides and the health downsides that are likely going to happen. What this means is that they try to reach the best conclusion for the most amount of people, which is what they generally do in order to stay in power, in order to not be voted out in the next election. What would happen if we would have these experts on their side? They're likely going to impose a 5-month lockdown in which people cannot get out of the house, completely shut down the economy in most situations, because they want to keep people away from, because they don't want people to be infected by COVID. But notice, they only focus on solving the pandemic. They don't care about even the health effects on other people, such as people that have cancer and are taken out of the hospital because they're not in critical conditions. They don't have to care about the psychological well-being of people that do not have anything to provide for their family and are forced to stay indoors because they don't have a job anymore. And moreover, they don't care about the layoffs and the economic meltdown that is likely going to result from their actions. Thus, we believe that first of all, the only legitimate actors to take the decision are the politicians, and secondly, they're likely going to take the better result for the most amount of people.
Thank you very much. We now welcome the second speaker on the proposition side.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Right. Panel, I think at the point at which team opposition thinks that pandemic experts are the only kind of experts, we think they've already lost. this debate. A few things in my speech. Firstly, on clarifications of the model. Secondly, a lot of rebuttal. Thirdly, on reconstruction. And finally, on scapegoating and deflecting of blame and what are the impacts of that? Firstly, then on the clarification of the model. We would say that the first quibble that they have with their model is that, oh, committees are very difficult to handle. You need a mediator, like a politician, to be able to handle this. But note, you can allocate experts themselves as the mediators, as the chair, as you have a chair in this debate, as the people who mediate these meetings. You can use a voting and peer review system to these kinds of things. We think it's a very mechanistic quibble that shouldn't play into this debate. Secondly, talk about extreme actions. But note, we specifically said in the model that we would get a variety of experts from different fields. We wouldn't just have medical or pandemic experts. You have a balance. You have economists, you have health experts, you have experts on disease. So you won't implement extreme measures like a 4-month lockdown because economists also take part in discussion. Medical experts aren't the only kinds of experts, guys. That, I think, takes out the vast majority of their analysis, because all their material about how you're going to have extreme response or going to have inadequate response because you only care about the pandemic and you don't care about the economic response is something that doesn't play into this debate, because economists also take part in the discussion. We think also equally professional bias doesn't play into this debate, because note, even if there is a professional bias, because there's experts from multiple fields, that professional bias is likely to get countered by the fact that other people have opposing professional biases. Finally then, on rebuttal. The first thing that they tell us is this weird argument on democracy. The reason why it's non-comparative and why we don't value democracy in this debate is because actions taken on both sides will lack democratic mandate. The reason for that is because pandemics are unexpected crises, and there are not issues that voters base their decisions on when they actually voted in the first place. It wasn't a voting issue, and voters didn't go to base their vote when they decided their ballot on the basis of policies that would be taken during pandemics. Because note, politicians never got to actually state their policies and stances on how they would deal with those pandemics, because by definition, they're very unexpected, and you never have the foresight to be able to tell what's going to happen, which means that Trump can't take a national poll in every day to base his policies, which means there's no input from the people regardless on either side, which means that we should care about actual outcomes instead of just this vague notion of democracy, because no, they don't have any democratic mandate on their side either, because these politicians never got to claim, yes, this is how I would deal with this virus, this is how I would deal with this pandemic, and that's why you should vote for me. Because that never happened on either side, we don't think any idea of democratic mandate stands. Secondly, they preemptively deal with backlash, because apparently this is what second all points to talk about. I would note that even in a democracy, 50% of people don't like Trump. 50% of people didn't vote for the party in power, which means 40 to 50% of people are still extremely unhappy with the policies being passed. So we think it's largely non-comparative, right? So even if you have a democracy, a large minority of people will still be unhappy with the policies passed because they didn't vote for the person in power. So we think that's non-comparative, and there's no reason to believe why people are just generally going to be unhappy with experts in power. Thirdly, then, we would just note that we're happy to jettison democratic principles if it means we can get substantially better outcomes for those who are most vulnerable and those who are abandoned by the democratic system. So we don't think democracy has a large role in this debate. Secondly, then, on reconstruction. Look, their main rebuttal, and I want to be very clear about this, their only response to our case was that, yes, you're going to have democratic incentives to get reelected. Crucially, this is the only response, that you have democratic incentives to get reelected, therefore there's an incentive to handle the crisis properly. Note, panel, this is the extent of the responsiveness. Why doesn't this work? Note, they have politicians have an incentive to, yes, get reelected, but crucially they have an incentive to care about their own voter base and their own party ideology and the people who are going to vote for them. This means that even if it leads to an overall worse outcome, they're going to help and prioritize resources for those who are going to vote for them. They're not going to try to care about African Americans in communities that don't vote, because note, even if they're left worse off because they don't vote, they can still win an election based on just helping their own friends. This is why Trump, for example, gave resources to his own politically connected and economically connected friends, because he knows that those are the people who are going to give him donations to help his campaign. Secondly, you're likely to have majoritarian incentives, right? This is something they didn't engage with. So even if it is the case that you're going to, generally care about how the outcome of the response is going to be, you're unlikely to devote resources where they're most needed. This is something that they didn't engage with, because you're unlikely to care about minorities, unlikely to care about demographics that don't systematically vote, because they're unlikely to contribute to your election, which means that even if minorities suffer, as long as your own voter base is pleased, and as long as you can keep those who are going to vote for you happy, you're unlikely to care about the incentives of those groups of people. This is very important.
Point of information.
Who are most likely to be actually affected by the pandemic. These are the people who are most likely to get laid off, people who are most likely to be financially insecure, and those who most need our aid. That's why it's so important that you actually care about the incentives of the minorities, even if it means jettisoning the politicians who are likely to care about the majoritarian incentives. Before I move on, yes.
So how on your side are experts held accountable if they do any of these problems, or do you just suppose they're perfect human beings?
Okay, this is what I was going to come on to next. What is the incentives of experts and why uniquely does it contrast with politicians? Two reasons. Number one, they dedicated their whole lives to working in these fields, which is why they're likely to care about the outcomes, which is why they're likely to care about what benefiting the people in the field that they're particularly devoted to. But more importantly, we think the way that they get promoted, the way that their incentives work is through peer reviewing, is through other experts in the field seeing that they did a good job and seeing that they've managed the crisis properly, which is why they have an incentive to act in the best interests, technically speaking, because their peers are going to promote them and review them in a positive way if they deal with the crisis effectively. That's why uniquely the incentives differ, and that's what they need to engage with. But what's all the material that Maxwell brought you that they didn't engage with? He told you about why we're likely to get better policy and more effective policy. First of all, on their side, they have a far slower response because these experts need to always brief the politicians on what's going on and to make sure that the politicians are well equipped to handle the issues. This is crucially important because a delay of days or weeks means more people losing their lives in a pandemic, which is why crucially you need a very quick response. Secondly, they're held down by partisan politics and ideology. Maxwell told you that the Republican Party, for example, is very libertarian, which is why Trump was very hesitant to impose a lockdown because his party ideology forbade him from doing so, which is why he's unlikely to implement policies which are beneficial for the actual lockdown, for the pandemic, because it's likely to, in many cases, it might go against the ideology of his party. But also Maxwell tells you about the fact that you're unlikely to concede to the opposition in a way because it hurts your own image and it seems as if you're conceding to the opposition party, which is why Trump was very hesitant to engage in the lockdown because Democrats pressured him to do so and he didn't want to seem as if he was bowing down to the Democratic agenda. This literally means that you're unlikely to be effective at the point at which your policy is delayed and staggered. But secondly, Maxwell tells you about political motivations. The fact is that they only care about the voters who actually are going to support them, which is why they're unlikely to devote resources and prioritize resources where they're most needed and more likely to devote them where their supporters exist. But finally, the communities which don't vote and aren't politically engaged are those who are left abandoned. These are the people who most need our aid and those who are most vulnerable in this debate. That's why you should care about those groups of people. But secondly, on the argument that they didn't even talk about was global cooperation and politicization. Maxwell told you that the fact that diplomatic tensions exist between nations, the fact that politicians are forced to adhere to the statements they made in the past about the fact that they don't like the EU, for example, means that they're unlikely to engage in endeavors that are actually beneficial because at the point at which Boris Johnson needs to save face and act as if he hates the EU, he's unlikely to engage in aid systems that are coming from the EU. This means distribution of resources, global aid and helping and cooperation, which is required for managing a global pandemic, isn't achieved. They never engage with any of the analysis, so all of our impacts then. Finally then, on scapegoating and deflecting of blame. Why is this likely to happen specifically when politicians are in power? This is because politicians were responsible for the initial circumstance. They were responsible for the blame, which is why they have a pressure to actually deflect that blame, but also because they care about re-election, they care about political incentives, they want to save face. Experts don't face the same pressure because they weren't responsible for the initial circumstances. There's no pressure for them to deflect blame necessarily, and because there's no need to protect the public image in a way. This is why politicians are susceptible to things like scapegoating minorities, people who their supporter base don't like. This looks like the BJP party in India endorsing a boycott on Muslim goods because their supporters are nationalists. This looks like Matteo Salvini in Italy blaming coronavirus on immigrants. This looks like Trump calling the coronavirus the Chinese virus. What does this lead to? This leads to increased xenophobia, targeting of these groups. Literally, hate crime in the United States against Asians grew drastically at the point at which Trump called the coronavirus the China virus. The racism and hate crime against Muslims in India grew drastically when these sort of policies were endorsed. This means that vulnerable minorities are targeted on their side, but also it means that solutions are sidetracked at the point at which politicians can deflect blame and not talk about the solutions and progress to these problems, but instead can deflect blame. Look, at the end of the day, we need to care about resolving the issues as soon as possible, resolving these pandemics as soon as possible, and prioritizing resources where they're most needed. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. We now welcome the second speaker from the opposition side.
Can you hear me if I speak like this? Since democracy has become a thing, there have been repeated attempts by various groups of experts to claim as though they should be the decision makers in certain times of crisis because it's their own field of expertise. In cases of war, the military supposedly, on Team Proposition's logic, is the one that should take the wheel, since they know the most about military strategy, and that's what matters most at that time. In times of perhaps economic crisis, then it's the economists that should dictate economic policy and not allow any sort of input from democratically accountable politicians. Panel, note that team proposition is defending today a principle that is not applied in any other circumstance, and we think that there are good systematic reasons for which that happens. Three main things in my speech. First, on principle, secondly, on pragmatics, and thirdly, on how giving the last call to experts leads to enormous backlash, my own substantive. But before that, let's talk a bit about some strategic notes and clarifications. Look, team proposition can't just brush off our problem with how you mediate the perspectives of various experts by just saying, oh, they're gonna have like professional mediators and it's gonna work out just fine. No, they have to explain how those things work. Because crucially, when it comes to having perhaps economists and health experts that try to adjudicate on what the best policy decisions should be on the same thing, right? The economists are probably going to say, look, the lockdown doesn't have to be that bad. We should probably not even go into a lockdown at all because it harms our economy. And then the doctors and the medical professionals are going to say, no, the lockdown is paramount to prevent ourselves from the impact of the pandemic. How do they reach a decision? Team proposition doesn't give us any response. So we're going to just assume that since it's about a health crisis, then it's likely that there will be like an inbuilt bias that when no party wants to compromise, when they don't want to make any sort of concessions to the other party, there will be one of them who will have to take the wheel and make the decision. It's likely in this case, since it's a medical crisis, that it's going to be the medical experts. And this is where a lot of our impacts still stand because they aren't capable of explaining to us how these disputes between various experts are adjudicated. They just claim that somehow they're going to reach like this amazing compromise that they never even explain what that might look like. We think that that's a really big strategic issue for them. Okay, let's enter into the principle side of things. Okay, so we tell you that there is a crucial problem when we actually give people who were not elected, right, who we have not consented for using the tools that the state has, right, using violence, using the police force, implementing policy, we just allow technocrats, experts to take all of those tools at their disposal. And they have this very funny response. They tell us that, oh, any decision lacks democratic mandate because people don't choose on the basis of a crisis response at any point during their election. So on this logic, then no sort of measure that is outside of the party manifesto should ever be taken for any government because look, they didn't mention it. No, thank you. So then therefore they have no legitimacy. But panel, this is not how it works. When we vote on people. This is why people aren't just called on referenda on all issues. They choose the people who they think are best fit to actually manage the issues that a country is confronted with, to manage issues of all types, and to manage even issues that might be unforeseen, circumstances that we can't predict. We think that this is the basic principle that representative democracy relies on, and we think that this applies even in this case, right? So in all other types of crises, we acknowledge that it's the leaders, the politicians, who have the authority to act, even though we couldn't foresee the crisis when we voted for them. We think that the same principle should be applied here. Our principle still stands. They haven't properly rebutted. But let's talk about the pragmatics, because this is where they have like multiple contentions. And look, ultimately, the premise of team proposition's argumentation is that politicians are super irresponsible and frankly stupid. Look, we agree that they are self-interested in many instances, but there is a crucial difference when it comes to times of crisis. In times of crisis, good decision-making can be the make or break of a politician. If you failed your response to the health crisis, which may be the biggest challenge of our times, then you are done as a politician. Your political career is out the window because you have failed in the moment when your action matters the most. So this essentially addresses most of their impacts, right? Because of course, in other instances, there are partisan squabbles, there is lobbying happening, there is like reticence towards international collaboration. But when it comes to ensuring that your political career, no thank you, is at stake and that you're still going to have a job afterwards and that you're not going to be done for the rest of your political career, you're probably going to have an incentive to try to ensure that things go as well as possible. And there are different incentives. For example, for national leaders, we think that their idea that, oh, they just appeal to their core constituencies. That's not true. Donald Trump knows that if he's not going to appeal to other people outside of his constituency, then they're going to be mobilized and vote for Joe Biden in the second in which they can do that. It just makes no sense for a national leader to exclude everyone who's not in their core constituency. So I think that they have an incentive to look out for the issues of everyone. But when it comes to local legislators, and this interacts with their point on minorities, look, minorities' views are represented accurately because you have people like AOC in the United States, or just like legislators that come from like minority districts that offer a voice to the concerns of those minorities. What makes us think that the body of experts will be so responsive to the needs of the majority? They never properly explained that, and so minorities are likely to be more overlooked on their side when they don't have a proper voice taking an active part in the decision-making process than on our side. Okay, let's talk about what the incentives of experts are. So they talk to us about this idea of peer review. That's their accountability. Peer review for epidemiologists happens by other people who are interested in studying pandemics and epidemics. So that means that they're not going to assess how well they handled the situation overall, but just how well they handled the possibility of stopping the pandemic. So this is where the issue starts, because we don't need here just people who are good at specific things. We have that on our side of the house as well. We need people who can properly adjudicate on what is the best course of action, what diminishes the aggregate suffering of people in those situations. The fact they are very happy that experts don't have a public image and that they are not accountable to the population. That's incredibly bad, because then they don't have to ensure that the population is actually well off after this entire crisis ends. They don't have to ensure they don't have to ensure that they're the ones who are doing well afterwards. That's a super big issue. Before I continue, yes.
Final politician, where do I focus aid? Communities that vote or communities that don't vote?
Look, so communities that don't vote might just as well be mobilized against you because you've handled this terribly. So you have an incentive to try to make things as good as possible. So we think that the impact on their side is actually that there will likely be extreme decision making. If it's the health experts that are going to be like the final adjudicators, they're probably going to have this professional bias, and they're going to have to neglect the needs of the economy. That's incredibly bad. But going into my own substantive about how backlash is likely to ensue. So we think that we've seen many protests, even in the status quo, against stay-at-home orders in states like Michigan and Texas in the United States. Right? People are very, very angry, and that's because they see those measures that have been imposed as something that is an abuse of authority. We think it's even more likely that they're going to see them as an abuse of authority when it comes from a figure that's not being elected by anyone, that's just been randomly appointed, and it is not properly accountable to any portion of the population. This is incredibly bad, panel, because we already see a lot of difficulties in trying to properly make people respect the guidelines that have been issued throughout the pandemic. This is likely to become even worse on their side of the house when the people who are issuing these guidelines aren't even democratically accountable. They're not recognized as legitimate. For all of these reasons, we beg you to oppose.
Thank you very much. We now welcome the third speaker on the proposition side.
Maybe it was the point that side opposition made this debate about economic outcomes that you probably realized, Judge, that they weren't probably the best side to vote for in a debate about a global pandemic. In a debate where it's about saving lives of ordinary people, we think fundamentally, I want to do three specific things. I want to look at, are we justified in this debate? Secondly, what are the incentives of politicians? And thirdly, where do we better help minorities in terms of actual minorities and also economic minorities? But firstly, I want to look at two specific things that came out of their last speech. Firstly, it was the mechanistic quibble that they went so about. I just want to point out, panel, this is strategically a bad move in an actual, given that it was never a policy debate, it was weird for them to constantly attack our motion. They never attacked the principal claims that we stood for. Because look, they had this weird claim that economists want to have no lockdown, whereas doctors do. This is a weird, panel. For an economist, getting over the pandemic is the best outcome because that's when you can fully restart the economy. So presumably, you'd probably vote for a lockdown because that's when you get over the thing, as opposed to opening early and then having more losses in the meanwhile. So obviously, panel, we think these people are reasonable. They're not as extreme as they, for some reason, weirdly characterize. We think even economists are human beings too. But secondly, notice, panel, they gave a weird counterexample about backlash. And this really works against them because people are backlashing to decisions made by politicians. Backlash exists on both sides because pandemic require unprecedented amount of times. No one's experienced pandemics, panel. Everyone in the public is scared. Obviously, people are going to lash out. But the problem on their side is, with their example, is that note Trump literally added flame to the fire by stoking people on because he had a political incentive because of his party's alliances to libertarianism. So crucially, their own example works against them because we see a politician stoking backlash because it benefits the ideology they represent. Fundamentally, that was not a crucial thing that they gave us. Firstly, are we justified? Note panel, they talk about accountability, right? Look, I think fundamentally, this idea of democracy rests on outcomes, right? If 6 out of 13 of us vote to kill someone in this room, that's democratic, but that's probably not the right thing to do. Crucially, in a pandemic, we think it doesn't matter about democracy because it's about the outcomes. But secondly, note, politicians also don't have accountability, right? We think the point when they're accountable is the next election cycle. In between then, a lot of people are going to die, guys. In between then, there's no political accountability for these politicians. So that is symmetric on either side of the house. Just as politicians have reign till the next election cycle, so do these people. But secondly, panel, they talk about the fact that this principle is not applied anywhere else. Yes, it is. Maxwell pointed out we have a Supreme Court, we have a Federal Reserve, because we understand in certain times, in certain sectors, democracy isn't the best way to approach this. Fundamentally, panel, their claims about principle doesn't stand when lives are on the line and we need to take quick, decisive actions and not wait for the slow wheels of democracy to turn to save lives. We think we are justified in this thing. But secondly, incentive of politicians. Crucially, panel, and this is really important, the key claim they have is that politicians it's a make or break thing for politicians. That's why Maxwell's speech was so important, because he tells you politicians therefore buy and give aid to big businesses. Because note panel, big businesses give you media platforms. Big businesses like Rupert Murdoch allow you to control the narrative. So yes, opposition, politicians do have an incentive to make themselves look good. That's why they bail out the big businesses. They give the economic packages to these people because these people control the narrative of what the response is like. It was unclear, panel, why all of a sudden we would have all of these accountability mechanisms. But secondly, panel, I think this is important, right? They concede it's about the voter base. We told you, there's certain groups like African Americans who never voted, who don't vote because they've been so disenfranchised. I think these people don't get the priority they deserve. What was their response to this? They said, oh, obviously these guys are going to mobilize around other people. No, because that's not how it's worked for years before. These people fundamentally are not engaged with the political system. We think politicians literally, therefore, instead of taking a risk on this group, they do what is more safe for them and vote and help out their own voter bases because politicians are risk-averse, guys. But secondly, this is important, panel. We give you the idea of suppression of information. Because notice, the entire premise of their accountability mechanism depends on the perception of this response. We told you, when politicians lead coronavirus briefings, when they control state response and state websites, they control the narrative of how this response is looking like. Fundamentally, we even told you how they literally have billionaire lobbyist friends that they can buy off. We think when the Republican Party is friends with Rupert Murdoch, that's when they can get positive coverage. When they're leading a virus response, that's when they can get positive virus. So yeah, I'll take you now.
Sir, so even your ideologized Trump agreed to give socialist stimulus checks to the entire population because he knows that that's necessary for the crisis to be contained.
The problem is, panel, it came months after it should have been. It came months in between people died. The lockdown came months after because Trump didn't want to bow down to Democrat demands of a lockdown. Trump cut pandemic response because that's something Obama implemented. We think when you necessarily cannot bow down to the opposition as a political party, that's when you put your own interests before those of the people. They have to stand for a world in which Trump cut pandemic response. Fundamentally, panel, we tell you, yes, politicians may get the responses, but the problem is it comes too late. They wait till the public pressure is too much because fundamentally they have as much incentive to deflect this. So even in their best case scenario, in between that period, thousands of people die. But why were our side, people more likely to respond in a beneficial way. Because we told you, panel, experts, people like doctors who've literally worked in hospitals, who've worked for the benefits of people, probably care about their sectors, because it's very bad for you as a doctor who's, for example, Dr. Fauci, if hospitals are overloaded. It's very bad for you as an economist if workers are dying. Fundamentally, their interests align with helping the people because the people necessarily help them. But even more than that, they have a professional obligation to these people, right? We think when you care about your field, when you work so much, we think you care. But even if you don't buy that panel, the point is, fundamentally, these people are able to take decisive actions because they don't have political obligations otherwise. So we think, panel, these people have better incentives and less political strings pulling them and making more decisive actions. But secondly, in terms of minorities, and this is where the bulk of our analysis comes in. We told you, panel, politicians are responsible for the circumstances, right, that create these things. We think during pandemics, people are scared, people are frightened. They're looking for someone to blame or hate or direct their anger. Politicians use their platform to spread misinformation, like BJP party who blames Muslims for this, like the Italian far-right political leader who blames refugees. Fundamentally, on their side, egregious acts against these people rises, xenophobia rises. But the comparative is, panel, problem is experts cannot call these out. On our side, when experts lead the response, lead the daily briefings, they can fundamentally call out these things as misinformation. On their side, they cannot, because if they call out or go against these politicians, they'll be sacked from the response team. Look, politicians are politicians have certain interests that restricts the way they can respond. In these unprecedented times, we need quick, decisive, unbiased actions that help people. We stand to save lives, proud to propose.
Thank you. We now welcome the third opposition speaker.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Just simply giving some examples of political mistakes and then saying democracy is the same when you are comparing literal voted people versus some random people that are for sure smart but have nothing to do with politics, which will decide the freedom of people, is not going to win you this final. We think we should anchor back in reality and look at the few just statements that were very well analyzed with impacts, but never truly analyzed on why they're actually true of team proposition's case. Let's tackle those things. So a big thing they're saying is that politicians only focus on their voter base. They're gonna discriminate minorities, and somehow we have these huge tyrants that are gonna lead the country. This is factually untrue. If they give us one single example in which this truly happened, then for sure they'll win the debate. Never has this actually happened. Politicians are not evil. They don't want to kill people. And second of all, panel, how do you use demographics in terms of your policies? Policies are universal. How can you even pragmatically even do these things? This is just something they never proved. They cannot win on such a lie. Second of all, their main thing in which they concede that the difference is that, look, politicians are too slow. Well, how is that actually comparative? How is it going to be fast to set up an actual committee of experts to simply choose between the different opinions that a lot of other experts have, to set this up, to even set it up on an international level as they seem as they're claiming? Humanity is slow when reacting to a pandemic because it's a crisis that people do not predict, that is normal and non-comparative. They never prove that something actually happens on their side. Another thing they say, politicians are ideologically biased. Panel, we explained to you that in times of a pandemic, the main and fundamental purpose of a politician is to serve the life of people and serve humanity. This is the main thing that's going to get them re-elected. And second of all, we see proof that ideology doesn't matter anymore. Trump is giving $2,000 to every single US citizen, although he's the biggest anti-socialist that US probably ever seen, right? We see that these things are not true. And lastly, on the international community and cooperation that they kind of dropped in their first speaker panel, that would be the most efficient thing to do. Every single country has a different context. Every country is different. This is an attack to a country's autonomy, and we literally cannot even see how this would help. Just because you'd have an international body that would dictate some changes, that would be an even bigger threat towards democracy. Now that we have proven to you why their claims and such big impacts do not actually happen, let's ask ourselves who actually makes the better call. And other problems we have with team proposition is that they have a huge lack of explanation on how their committee actually looks like, on how it's efficient. Even if they did a good job on proving that politicians might be bad in some instances, they never actually proved the efficiency of this community. Because when we said that there are political trade-offs, they said yes, but we'll have experts from multiple fields that can do these trade-offs as well. So they concede the problem is political. They concede that we cannot only let doctors dictate what happens in a pandemic. The only thing is, well, the issue is political, but our problem is that politicians decide political stuff. We only want experts to decide political stuff. So if they do concede that the issue is political, then we don't see what their actual inherent problem with politicians doing the trade-offs is. Because, panel, there's no politician out there that's gonna ultimately become a health expert and gonna decide for himself what's good for the health of people. Like, countries have ministries of healthcare, of economics. All these experts already exist in the political side and do take in like the governmental structure, they do consult each other and take decisions. It's not like we're speaking about people who have no idea what to do. The biggest problem that we have is that experts, the experts they are speaking about, have no actual political knowledge, right? They might be great people in their fields, but they do not have good knowledge. And an example of this would be the thing they said. They said, like, look, the US should open trade up to China because that would help the humanity in a pandemic. They never proved why this is true. But just imagine that. They would literally go over all the US's administration, economical planning, just because they think there are some good experts that know how international politics work. That is the thing that literally proves how little knowledge these experts of politics could actually have, right? So we think that at the end of this day, like literally, they never even proved how these people would settle. Because if they said we'll have people from multiple fields, then how will they, why will they simply just settle on something because they will have different opinions? This is all unclear and is most probably a huge risk if you want to pass team propositions policy. Last thing I'm gonna say, when we asked them what the comparative is, their only answer in a second, their only answer was, well, you know, experts have dedicated their whole lives to being experts. Guess what? So did politicians. This is not enough to prove the comparative on their side. The fact that you cannot hold them accountable is a huge risk. Politicians can be held accountable through voting. Before I move on, I'll take an intervention.
Did Trump playing down coronavirus for the first few months and blaming Democrats increase or decrease the spread of coronavirus?
Well, no, first of all, we think that it's still up for political debate, like for factual debate, if this is true or not. They can just assume it on their side. But second of all, they literally cannot prove that in that 2 months, we would already have a committee that is being settled and that would have actually taken the action against them. But let's speak about now what we have explained to you, and they have been very dismissive of this. First of all, we tell you that literally, even if in the worst case scenario, they do prove that the committee takes the better call, we still win this debate. And the reasoning is simple. Here, our third argument, to which they don't actually respond, comes in clutch. Because even if it's the good medical choice that people should be doing, the fact that they do not trust their authority, they never voted for these experts, the fact that they protest at the moment, Panel, just imagine how they would protest when people that don't have any kind of political approval would tell that they should give up their rights. If they do consider people protest, they have lost this debate, because they would go mad when simple decisions, even if they would be the literal same decisions that politicians would do, they would go mad when they're coming from these experts. So it's not even that they protest, it's simply, if only they just don't respect quarantine, they don't respect the decisions that these experts have been done. Like, even if it's the right call, the fact that the people do not trust it will make the end result to be bad. We've seen that in countries in which people didn't respect the social distancing norms, things have gotten worse. The fact that people are panicked and have a lack of trust in general is bad, but their policy makes this 10 times worse, and it's hugely going to affect how people can react. Panel, democracy is an absolute right. We have proven this. Democracy is not about simply about the outcome. In order to have legitimacy to restrict one's right, you have to respect democracy. You have to respect what people want. The only side that does that is Team Opposition. Team Romania takes the online trophy.
Thank you very much. We now welcome the reply speaker from the opposition side.
Can you hear me if I speak like this? The Federal Reserve, a non-democratic institution, is overseeing some aspects of economic policy. We'll give Team Proposition that. But it's not overseeing the response of any nation, of the United States, certainly not, over economic crises. That's what the president and the executive, together with the legislative, do. The Pentagon oversees some of the military policy of the United States, but it doesn't manage and it doesn't decide what the country does once it's at war. It's still the democratically elected politicians that do that. That's because in times of crisis, panel, we don't just need experts in general. We need a specific kind of expert. Experts in decision-making, experts in weighing benefits and harms, experts in making trade-offs, and politicians are those experts, whether we like them or not. Two main points in my reply speech, on principle and then on pragmatics. But before that, just a small clarification about how bad this debate has gotten, because Team Proposition refused to tell us how these decisions are being made amongst experts. Because they tell us we're going to have experts from every single field so that we cover every possible impact of the pandemic. But then again, how do they reach a consensus? First, who adjudicates when they can't make any sort of decisions? We assume that since Team Proposition probably wants them to make a decision, we've told you throughout the bench that it's likely that one team of experts will decide and will make the final call. It's probably going to be the health experts because they're the ones who know most. But second, if they have to go for these debates, panel, just think about the sort of delay that would occur. If politicians are bad at speedy responses, then their very weird mechanism of consulting experts is going to be even worse. So first, on principle, we've told you very clearly from the get-go, from our very first speech, using the tools of the state, such as locking people up and using violence against citizens, is something that we allow just a specific type of people to do, the people whom we consent to have that power. They tell us, oh, but politicians don't tell us what they're going to do in times of crisis. So that's not a decision that is democratically sanctioned. Right. We don't vote on policies. We vote on people, on those who are going to be taking the decisions whenever something arises in our country. Our principle stands upon the end of this debate. They haven't proved why it wouldn't. So we think we already win this debate just on principle. Second, on pragmatics. Let's compare politicians and health experts on multiple criteria. The first one, accountability. What are politicians accountable for? They're accountable for the welfare of their people. Why? Because it's the people that are going to be voting them in or out. They're not only accountable to the a small number of people who have voted on them, small comparatively to the entire size of the country, they're accountable to everyone, because if they anger a portion of the population just too much, then that portion of the population might just go against them at the next election. They can't take such a risk when they're a national politician who has to count on white support in order to stay in power. So we think that it's likely that they want to ensure that as much of the suffering that can be created by pandemics is reduced. But also we have local legislators that actually care about minorities, that actually represent majority minority districts, and that give their people a voice. What do health experts have? They have accountability to their own colleagues, to the people who care about the same specific niche of human knowledge and human understanding as they do. The doctors are going to be accountable to other doctors that are going to judge them on the basis of how much they've helped solve the pandemic, not its economic effects, not its mental health effects, and so on and so forth. So it might just be that these people are not going to be very compromise minded. It might just be that some decisions will be very, very, very extreme. But also, when it comes to backlash, panel, we think that it's much likelier that people are just going to reject the legitimacy of unelected bureaucrats, as they do with the European Union and with any other unelected institution in the world, rather than rejecting the legitimacy of politicians that are elected. Even though they do sometimes do that, we think that they largely respect it. So we think by the end of the debate, we have won it.
Thank you very much. And we now welcome the reply speaker and the last speaker of this debate from the proposition side.
Hi, can you hear me? Everything fine, right? Okay. Panel, let me quote third op speaker. If proposition can give a single example of politicians mismanaging crises and discriminating against minorities, essentially, then they will win this debate. Let me tell you the few examples that we gave you down the bench. We told you about the fact that Trump gave most of the stimulus aid to large corporations, to the people who fund his campaign. We told you about the fact that poor communities are neglected. Medical aid doesn't go to their areas specifically because politicians know that they aren't going to vote. We told you about Matteo Salvini in Italy, who blamed the coronavirus on immigrants, on 5G networks. We told you about the fact that Trump called the virus the Chinese virus, which led to discrimination and hatred of Asians in America. The fact that opposition wants to rely on real world examples that we don't give you to win this debate clearly shows that they haven't listened to our case. A few things in the speech. Firstly, on the mechanistic quibble that they had. Secondly, on democracy. And finally, on practical outcomes. What was the problem that they had with the way we set up this debate? Because, panel, we were pretty clear, I think. In the same way that today's panel was organized, in the same way that we are being judged today, we told you that an expert is chosen to be the chair, as there is a chair today, and they mediate their discourse, and they also vote at the end. We think this was very clear from the first speech to the third, and the fact that they were unable to charitably engage with that was quite clear. At the end of the debate, you vote for which policy you think you would like to support, in the same way that today's panel is going to be voting. Because, panel, unless you think that today's panel is completely incapable of making a decision about who won this debate, we think you side with side proposition on this clash. Secondly, then, on the democratic principle. Look, they essentially said that you need democratic legitimacy to pass these policies. Why does this fall? Look, there's no democratic mandate on either side of the House. We told you the fact that voters don't base their decisions on these crises because they're unexpected by definition, and that you aren't able to take into account how politicians are going to deal with these crises when it comes to it. And so you're unable to actually, you don't have the democratic mandate on either side of the House. They never actually charitably engaged with this. The only thing they said was that, well, we have other actions that politicians need to have legitimacy for. But panel, you have a question to ask yourself here. Do you care about that tiny bit of marginal democracy that you get when these politicians, when the person who you like because of a popularity contest takes a policy that you never actually got to vote on in the first place, or do you actually care about better practical outcomes? But look, secondly, we would point out that legitimacy of action doesn't just come from consent, right? Democracies and governments care about the interests of children, for example, who don't vote them into power necessarily, but they still care about their interests because practical outcomes often justify legitimacy. The fact that you don't vote a government in necessarily doesn't mean the government's actions aren't legitimate. But finally, look, their only practical impact to this argument was that people are going to be unhappy and there's going to be backlash. Panel, look at the status quo. People, Trump supporters specifically, are also still protesting the lockdown. We think this is largely uncomparative and people are going to be unhappy on either side of the house. But also note, in a democracy, 40% to 50% of the voters didn't even vote for the person in power, which means they're unlikely to be happy on either side. This democracy argument simply falls. But finally, on the most important clash, how do we get better policy? Look, first of all, I'd just like to note they said the existence of the coronavirus is still up for political debate. That's just ludicrous and shows the extent to which they just don't care about political and practical outcomes in this debate. But look, they had broadly one contention here. They essentially said that democratic incentives will solve for everything. The fact that politicians have an incentive to do a great job because they have electoral incentives because they want to get into power. But crucially, what opposition failed to realize was the specific nuance of which people they care about and where they choose to prioritize their resources. Because note, we told you down the bench that their efforts are likely to be focused on the groups specifically which vote for them, the groups specifically which fund their campaigns. And that's specifically what these political incentives look like. They're likely to focus resources on donors, voter bases, and they're likely to adhere to political ideology, and they're likely to be majoritarian. Their only response to this was like, how practically can you discriminate? Look, you can do things like provide the vast majority of the stimulus package to only large corporations. You can do things like prioritize resources and medical aid to communities that vote for you instead of prioritizing for them communities that need them the most. We just think it's ludicrous for them to say, well, practically you can't really discriminate against people who are poor. There are many ways to do it, and we are seeing it in the status quo. And it means that these communities who need the aid the most were most vulnerable to the virus, and the economic impacts are neglected. But finally, on global cooperation, they say global cooperation is useless. That was the only rebuttal that they had. We told you that's incredibly incharitable. The fact is that you need global cooperation to give information, to give transparency, so that the next country who's likely to be hit is prepared. The fact that you need to be able to distribute resources, things like ventilators, like masks, these are things that they never get on their side of the point which there isn't global cooperation. But finally, they didn't even talk about scapegoating, or the fact that minorities are abused and inflicted, like hate crimes inflicted upon them at the point which politicians use them for scapegoating. Panel, at the end of the day, we need to recover from these pandemics as quickly as possible, and we need decisive action without bias and without any sort of political motivation. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much to both teams for what was an excellent and really enjoyable, quite timely debate as well. So what's going to happen now is the judges are going to move to a different room, and we will have to think very hard about this debate and cast our ballots, and then we'll have a quick chat, and we will return to explain the decision. So excuse us for a few minutes. Again, thank you very much for a great debate.